Okay, we are halfway through chapter 7, I think. Let's double check. Yep, halfway through chapter 7, so we're going to finish it and see how far we can get. Can we get to chapter 9? They turned and stared in amazement at the crystal ball. Remember, she snuck into her dad's office because the door unlocked itself and there's like mist and stuff everywhere. "I've never seen one of those before," whispered Yoshi. "Freaky, isn't it?" said Misty, reaching out to touch the orb. Orb just means the crystal ball. Suddenly a thin yellow thread of light streaked from the crystal ball and hit Misty's palm with an electrical crackle. In an instant, the light shot back into the ball and the table trembled. "What was that?" shouted Misty. "It's changing colors," said Yoshi, mesmerized, as the orb went from golden yellow to emerald green. The girls sat next to each other at the table and watched as a still image began to appear within the crystal ball. First cloudy, as if in a dream, and then clearer until coming into focus. And what did the image reveal but a young boy on a bike? He looked very, very familiar to Misty. "That's my dad," realized Misty. "That's my dad when he was James's age." The girls gazed in wonder at the image. "I wonder where he's going," said Misty. Just then, as if granting her request, an image in the crystal ball was set in motion. Misty and Yoshi watched, spellbound, as the young Mr. Gordon began pedaling down tree-lined Shadow Street. "The tree tunnel," murmured Misty. "What had her dad said on their way to Madame Zaster's house? 'I haven't been down this street since I was a boy.'" "I bet he's headed to Madame Zaster's house," said Misty. Sure enough, young Mr. Gordon stopped his bike in front of Madame Zaster's house, tiptoed to one of its windows, and peeked inside. "What is he doing?" asked Yoshi. "He's spying on something going on inside Madame Zaster's house," guessed Misty. "Too bad we can't see what he's holding, what he's looking at. Ugh, I wish we could at least hear what's going on." At that moment, a radio atop Mr. Gordon's desk clicked on by itself. Misty and Yoshi gulped as the thick sound of static came from the radio. They listened intently as the static was replaced by another sound, that of leaves crunching beneath young Mr. Gordon's feet as he moved along the edges of Madame Zaster's house. "We've got audio," said Misty. The girls continued to watch and listen to the crystal ball and the radio as if they were playing a home movie before their eyes. Young Mr. Gordon was getting bold now as he stood outside Madame Zaster's open window, stretching his head higher and higher over the windowsill to get a better view of what was going on inside. Suddenly, a familiar, hateful voice issued from inside Madame Zaster's cottage. "Spying on us! I'll fix him!" In the next second, Hazel Monger, younger but still scary, reached out of the window and grabbed Mr. Gordon. Young Mr. Gordon. "Who are you?" she hissed wickedly. Frank Gordon," he stammered, frightened. "You little brat!" she shrieked, shaking him. "What did you see? What did you hear? Tell me!" "Just something about the Golden Three," he cried, trying to pull away. "That they're buried in Ashcrumb somewhere." She struck him across the face. "I'm warning you, Frank Gordon," she snarled, her face white with fury. Means she's super angry. "You better not utter a word of this to anyone. Only the descendants are the rightful heirs to the Golden Three. Do you understand?" Frank Gordon whimpered and nodded. "Forget everything you saw and heard today, and don't you dare," she added, her black eyes gleaming, "don't you dare get any ideas." Finally, young Mr. Gordon broke from Hazel Monger's grasp, jumped on his bike, and sped off. The crystal ball glowed violet, and then it went dim, as if a plug had been pulled. For a minute, Misty and Yoshi just stared, at the dark orb. That was amazing, said Yoshi. Misty nodded, awestruck. Something just dawned on me, Misty finally said. Remember the entry in Fanny Belcher's diary when she was talking about a boy who interrupted the seance? Yeah, said Yoshi. Now we know that that boy was my dad, said Misty. He got to see all 3 descendants at the seance. So far, we know that 2 of the descendants were Franny Belcher and Hazel Monger. I wonder who the 3rd descendant could be. Or rather, could have been, added Yoshi. That person is probably dead by now, like Franny Belcher. What makes you think that the 3rd descendant is dead? Argued Misty. After all, 100-year-old Hazel Monger is still alive. And take Mr. Yates, for example, suggested Misty. Mr. Yates is 99, and he's still alive, and... Misty grabbed Yoshi. What if, said Misty. What if what? Said Yoshi. Spit it out. What if Mr. Yates is the 3rd descendant, said Misty. Think about it. He's the same age as the other descendants, and that would explain how he knew Madame Zaster's riddle. Do you really think so? Said Yoshi. Misty nodded. Well, even if Mr. Yates happens to be the 3rd descendant, we still know nothing about the Golden 3, said Yoshi. Why don't you just ask your dad about them? Ask my dad, coughed Misty. I don't think that's such a good idea. Then he'd know I'd been snooping around. I mean, he'd totally freak if he knew we'd been in his study. Misty got up from the chair. In fact, let's get out of here right now. They'd just shut the door behind them when Yoshi paused. What happened to your hand? She asked Misty. Misty looked. To her surprise, there were mysterious black lines webbing across the palm of her right hand. She quickly rubbed the lines, but they wouldn't come off. How weird, said Misty. I guess I got them from those electrical currents that came out of the crystal ball. Do they sting? Asked Yoshi. No, said Misty, puzzled. Well, said Yoshi, looking at the marks, maybe they'll fade away. But they didn't. In fact, by the end of the day, the marks on Misty's hand had grown as dark and deep as the mystery behind them. Chapter 8, A Dark History Lesson. Margie Medford sat in her crossing guard chair, steam rising from her head as she took swigs of piping hot coffee and grumbled to herself. She was in a fouler mood than usual, having had to get up early that morning in order to de-ice the school's crossing lane with salt. Adding to her fury was the fact that the donuts she was eating were stale. She muttered beneath her breath, staring straight ahead at the point where the children would soon appear. What was taking them so long today? She reached into the donut box, grabbed the last one, and stuffed it into her mouth. Chewing and brooding, Medford caught sight of some kids heading her way. She tossed the box aside and stood, the ice cracking beneath her. She stretched her arms and waved the stop sign. She was ready. Hurry, hurry! She urged a pack of first graders as they struggled in the slush. A girl in pigtails fell. Whiny baby, Medford taunted. A little ice never hurt anybody. Another group trotted past, their heads down like a rushing team of donkeys. That's right, yelled Medford. Just keep moving, moving, moving. She stopped, panting, waiting for the next miserable bunch of weasels. Medford smiled. Jimmy Wynn was coming. She cracked her chapped knuckles and breathed in deeply, her heart racing in anticipation of giving his ears a good boxing. There's nothing like thumping ice-cold ears, she chuckled. She was just pulling her arms back when Jimmy came into clearer view. Medford couldn't believe it. The little turkey had worn earmuffs. She stomped her feet and gave him a short, brutish shove. Chicken! She bellowed. Oh, what wouldn't she give just to punch a couple of ears this morning? Medford twitched. Here came Hector Fig, Misty Gordon, and her smarty-pants friend Yoshi Yamamoto. Medford decided to let them pass. They were too quick. And besides, Medford needed to save up her energy for terrorizing, lollygagging James Gordon, who just so happened to be the last kid to lumber across the walk that morning. Finally, along came James, all by himself, like a lone, defenseless puppy. Medford checked to make sure the coast was clear. It was too good to be true. There wasn't an adult around, not a teacher, not a parent. Nobody. James was all hers. Medford backed herself behind a tree and waited. James strode on, but as he passed the tree, he noticed Medford's big brown boots sticking out from behind its trunk, like two massive mushrooms. James did a kung fu kick and shot ahead. Medford charged after him, taking a swipe at his ears, but missing. "Ah!" she thundered as James made it safely to the other side before disappearing into the castle. Medford marched back to her chair and kicked the donut box. Then she saw something in the trees, a looming dark figure. Medford took a few steps toward it and squinted. Was that fur? The playground beast, she stammered, frantically bringing the whistle to her mouth and blowing. "Attention, faculty, staff, and students of Ashcombe Elementary," Vice Principal Barrel called over the school intercom. "There has been an incident in front of the castle involving Margie Medford. Do not panic. We have everything under control." Misty and Yoshi dashed to their classroom window and looked out at the parking lot where Margie Medford was being carried away on a stretcher. She was still blowing her whistle as she was loaded into the ambulance. "Looks like Medford finally blew a fuse," Yoshi said under her breath to Misty. "That's enough, class," said Mrs. Lane, pulling the blinds down. "Back to your desks." Standing in front of the chalkboard, Mrs. Lane tucked her messy blonde hair behind her ears and smiled. "I have a special surprise for you, students. As it plays so prominent a role in our town's history, I thought it would be pertinent to discuss the sinking of the Royal Ashcombe. Here to explain it is a very special guest, the director of the Ashcombe Museum, my husband, Mr. Lane." The class gave a few feeble claps, and in walked tall, lanky Mr. Lane, decked from head to toe in a dashing 17th century period costume, a broad-brimmed hat, a lace-collared shirt and doublet, breeches, and buckled shoes. He took a sweeping bow. Hear ye, he said in character. "Listen up as I tell the disastrous story of the sinking of the Royal Ashcombe." The class snickered. "The year was 1630, Mr. Lane began. It had been 10 years since the Mayflower had landed in New England. America now had a number of colonies, many of them under the rule of England. King Charles I, who happened to be King of England at the time, wanted his very own kingdom in America, a sort of colony just for royalty. It was the king's hope that once this royal colony was established with castle and all, he would move there. The first step toward establishing his new kingdom was swiftly accomplished. King Charles sent the most glorious ship in his fleet, the Royal Ashcombe, to America and founded the Royal Colony of Ashcombe, which he named after the ship. Within several months, it was peopled with a number of royal colonists. The next step was to build a castle for His Majesty. It took a bit longer. After 3 years, the castle, which now serves as your school, was finished. The last step was to furnish the castle so that King Charles could move into it. So in 1633, the ship, the Royal Ashcombe, set sail again for the royal colony of Ashcombe with objects for King Charles' new castle. But the ship was transporting more than just King Charles' furniture and art. Mr. Lane paused dramatically, his finger in the air. The ship was transporting the king's most recently acquired and prized possessions. 3 golden Greek statues of Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades, which supposedly had powers. They were rumored to have magical powers. They had been recently unearthed after being lost for ages. Misty and Yoshi sat bolt upright and gaped at each other. You see, King Charles, who believed in the divine right of kings, felt that these statues, which supposedly had powers over the waters, heavens, and death, would help him achieve absolute rule over everything. With the statues, King Charles truly believed his royal colony in America would become the most powerful kingdom in the world. Can you see them? The light kind of shines not helpfully, doesn't it? Yoshi raised her hand. Why didn't King Charles just use the statues in England? Historians, such as myself, speculate that His Majesty didn't want to take any chances, replied Mr. Lane. He probably knew that there were many other parties interested in getting their hands on the statues. Rather than risking the statues being stolen before he could fully understand how to use them, the king decided to ship them off to his new colony, where, in the safety of his controlled kingdom, he could take his time in learning how to harness their powers. Mr. Lane paused. Of course, that's just an educated guess. He snorted pompously. A very, very educated guess, I might add, considering I am a very educated man. He smiled smugly and continued. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes, meanwhile, the county of royal colonists was waiting for the ship to arrive. Finally, one evening, a watchman atop the bell tower spotted the royal ashcrum and rang the bell, signaling the arrival of the ship to the other colonists. Alas, it would be the last time the bell would ring, for it would soon be damaged in the foul weather that was brewing. For an Atlantic scullabuster, the most wicked of sea storms came out of nowhere. As the ship sailed into the bay, it was struck by lightning and caught on fire. It quickly began to sink. The fire and raging storm consumed nearly everyone aboard the ship. As for the 3 golden statues, they were lost. With his precious statues gone, King Charles' hopes for supreme rule were dashed, and he abandoned his dream of a royal colony, not even making the overseas journey to visit his new castle. And some years later, added Mr. Lane, removing his hat and placing it over his belly, His Highness was beheaded. And that is the story of the royal ashcrum. Are there any questions? So, who were the survivors? Asked Misty. Sadly, only 3 passengers of the royal ashcrum survived the disaster, said Mr. Lane. They were among the royal ashcrum's crew. Captain Nicholas Yates and his officers, William Monger and Benton Belcher. Interestingly, added Mr. Lane, until recently, the last 3 descendants of Captain Yates and officers Belcher and Monger could be found still alive in this town. With the passing of the late Fanny Belcher, the final 2 are Hazel Monger and Mr. Lewis Yates. Lewis Yates works at my dad's antique store, said Misty. Mr. Lane gave Misty a curious look. The bell rang and the students began to file out of the room. Excuse me, said Mr. Lane, stopping Misty on her way out. Could I speak with you for a moment? Sure. Did you say that you know Mr. Lewis Yates? Yes, said Misty. Like I said, he works at my family's antique store. Well, the truth is The Ashcombe Museum has been trying for years to persuade Mr. Yates to let us buy a particular item that he has in his possession. Mr. Lane rubbed his hands together. I really believe that the museum should have this item since it is such an historic piece. What is it? Said Misty. It's a doublet, said Mr. Lane. An old black doublet from the 1600s. Do you know the one I'm talking about? We do. Yes, said Misty. Mr. Yates offered to let my brother wear it as a Halloween costume. What? Cried Mr. Lane, shocked. Mr. Yates was going to let a boy wear an important historic artifact for trick-or-treating? I'm appalled. Why? Asked Misty. What's the big deal? I'll tell you what the big deal is, said Mr. Lane, becoming more irritated by the minute. That doublet happened to belong to Captain Yates. It was the very doublet that the revered Captain Yates was wearing when the Royal Ashcombe sank. It was handed down to Louis Yates as an heirloom, of course. Are you sure it belonged to Captain Yates? Said Misty, recalling the grisly apparition, ghost, that had appeared wearing the doublet. Yes, I'm sure, snorted Mr. Lane, indignant. I'm an expert. I happen to be the director of the Ashcombe Museum for a reason, you know. Misty wondered, how could the bloody, horrifying ghost she saw in the doublet at the dearly departed have been the spirit of Captain Yates? The evil-looking spirit had hardly looked like a revered royal captain. Suddenly, Misty remembered the skull and snake tattoo on the ghost's neck and the words Black Adders. Are you certain that the doublet didn't belong to a man named Black Adders? Asked Misty. Black Adders, choked Mr. Lane. Of course not. The Black Adders was the name of a gang of pirates. Clever pirates, too. Very diabolical. That means like evil. They called themselves the Black Adders because they were like snakes that would slip into other people's skins. They were always disguising themselves. They would take over ships, kill everyone aboard, and then assume the identity of their victims. But enough of the Black Adders, barked Mr. Lane, flustered. Would you please try to convince Mr. Yates to sell the doublet to the museum? It's bad enough that Ashcombe Elementary uses the Royal Ashcombe's mermaid figurehead as playground equipment. And now Mr. Yates is turning another one of its precious artifacts into a Halloween costume. Mr. Lane was growing redder by the moment. Will you please talk to Mr. Yates about the doublet? Okay, Misty murmured. Thank you, said Mr. Lane, regaining his composure. You know, you look a little pale. You might be coming down with a cold. Mr. Lane, said Misty weakly. Yes. What became of the Black Adders? Nobody knows, he replied, checking his watch. They disappeared about the same time the Royal Ashcombe sank. Well, I suppose you should be off to your next class. He tipped his hat to Misty. I hope you've learned some interesting tidbits about Ashcombe's history. Then he walked off, his buckled shoes clattering down the hall. Tidbits? How about this for a tidbit, Mr. Lane? Thought Misty. It may have been Captain Yates and his crew who set sail from England to America, but it wasn't they who steered the Royal Ashcombe into Ashcombe Bay. It was the gang of pirates, the Black Adders, disguised as Captain Yates, Officer Monger, Officer Belcher, and crew. She's thinking all this in her head. Which could only mean that the Royal Ashcombe had been taken over at sea by pirates. And why would pirates have seized the ship? Could it be that they knew the Golden Greek statues of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were on board and believed they possessed powers? That would explain the beginning of the riddle. When English garb, clothes, did fool the county, snakes passed in with royal bounty. Bounty is like treasure. The snakes were the Black Adders, Misty whispered to herself, and the royal bounty was the golden statues. Misty walked down the hall as if in a daze, bumping into people as she thought about it all. Not only had Misty learned what the Golden Three were, she had discovered what descendants meant. Descendants of the Black Adders. The last 3 remaining descendants were the late Fanny Belcher, Hazel Monger, and Mr. Yates, who believed they were the rightful heirs to the mythical and powerful Golden Three, magic treasures that had yet to be found. Misty stood at her locker, chills running down her spine. Strangely, she now found herself gripped by the mystery that had driven and haunted the descendants. Were the Golden Three buried in Ashcrum? And if so, where? Yoshi approached. "What's the matter, Misty?" she asked. "You look completely weirded out. Tell me what Mr. Lane said to you back there." "Okay," whispered Misty, "but be prepared to be weirded out too." But nothing could have prepared Yoshi for what she was about to hear. End of chapter 8. I just had to get it, so we read a little bit longer today. More later.